to have great technical assistance. Thank you very much indeed. The joys of being a lawyer. So for today, I wanted to do very briefly for this new topic on ESG, environment, social and governance, law and practice, a bit of an overview. Then looking at risk, which is some of the key issues we look at within environmental sustainable governance. And then finally, looking at some of the issues around due diligence, risk assessment. The presentation will be available online, and there's a lot more information than I can deal with in the 15 minutes that is allotted. But there's a lot of richness in the presentations today. So one of the things we also have to think about is the question of risk. And I often start with the idea of the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, which was in 2018. And it identified a number of key risks. And in the top right-hand corner, we have some of these key risks that are emerging. And this was the CEOs and the chief financial officers identifying that 3 of the core risks that they thought they were facing in 2018 included emerging weather events, natural disasters, and failure of climate change regulation and adaptation. There was also another green issue there, which was biodiversity loss, which is particularly appropriate today in Australia with the release of the State of Environment report, which has painted a devastating picture of the incompetence and neglect by previous administrations on the environment in Australia, and something that the new Australian government will have to prioritise and focus on if it's going to stop the Australian biodiversity from collapsing. But in 2018, when people looked at the global risks, we saw one thing that was clearly not on the agenda at that point of time, and that was the idea of pandemics, and particular health risks associated with pandemics. Well, then when we move forward to 2020 and the Global Risk Report, we saw a different change. We saw obviously pandemics and infectious diseases becoming a significant risk that people had to respond to. We also saw climate change failure just next to it as being one of those things that the CEOs, the chief financial operators, those involved in the World Economic Forum meant as one of the most significant risks that they face in their business and for the planet. And you can see that in terms of the risks identified, issues of biodiversity collapse, issues of extreme weather events, issues of human environmental damage and biodiversity loss, all of these environmental factors are the focus of the attention of those leaders at the World Economic Forum. When we think about environmental, social and governance risk, it's also valuable to think about some of those components within the environment. We've identified climate risk and pollution, biodiversity loss as being key environmental risks. But we also have to look at the social risks, things like labour standards, the issues of modern slavery, the engagement of Indigenous people in development, resettlement for large projects, but also issues of data privacy and product safety that all pose potential social risks to corporations. And then in the governance area, we're talking about board diversity, bribery and corruption, data security, and issues that have emerged as well on executive compensation, gender and inclusion, not only in decision-making, but also throughout corporations and throughout entities. And finally, the conflict and instability, which we're all too well aware of in our region within Southeast Asia. And finally, within the context of ESG, we have the Sustainable Development Goals. It's interesting that Sustainable Development Goals are very much part of the decision-making process in Southeast Asia. And I'm based in Bangkok, and I've been there for 12 years working within the ASEAN region. And government decisions are mostly focused on achieving and implementing the Sustainable Development Goals health risks associated with these are not often well understood by developed countries, economies and corporations, but it's emerging as being a key decision-making tool that they can use and key strategic approaches that can incorporate the Sustainable Development Goals. So then, again, at this very broad overview of ESG, we look at what we call ESG risk. And we have a definition of risk: the probability of harm arising from activities or failure to anticipate harm that could be either directly related to a project or indirectly for shareholders. It could be related to a policy or approach adopted by a corporation, by a government, or some other entity. And that is sort of the risk that we have to examine. And then under that risk, when we've identified the risk, what we often do within this context of ESG law and practice is we try and assess of the issues about reporting requirements that have certainly emerged as one of the ways of reporting and identifying those particular risks that have been assessed. But it's also stronger than that, because one of the things about risk assessment is to identify what are likely to be those key impacts from those key risks. And a lot of my work in environmental impact assessment is working on major project development and advising governments on how they incorporate risk assessment into their environmental management approaches and environmental impact assessments, and how that risk can be addressed either through modification of project or through conditions attached to the project. And once we've done this risk assessment, where we look at investment activities and we screen them and identify those risks, we develop what we call the table. And it's a risk assessment table that looks at the likelihood of the consequence of the risk and the severity of the consequence. And we can do that for all identifiable risks. It's the risks that then become extreme or high or moderate that we then focus on, whereas the risks that I identify as potentially of low impact are the risks that we can manage, but manage effectively without necessarily focusing on those particularly important risks. Now, in his introduction, Rocky mentioned some of the overarching international guidance documents, and we can see that within the last 10 years, really from the development of what we call the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, which were adopted in 2011, the world has developed a range of options looking at how we guide decisions and how we incorporate environmental and social governance. It wasn't necessarily identified back then as ESG, but it certainly developed in the consequences of business and human rights. The framework principles of environmental and human rights were also developed under John Knox, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, and things such as the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, which now have over $1 trillion worth of investment under management. That the companies who are managing those have come up and signed these voluntary principles for responsible investment. We also have the UN Global Compact and a very important document, the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, which also identifies key components that companies and enterprises should examine when they're considering their business operations. Here are the 10 principles of the Global Compact, which deal with human rights, labour and the environment, and anti-corruption, the 4 key elements. And within that, there are a number of components that companies are required to address when they sign up to the Global Compact. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which is a voluntary approach adopted by states, that has 3 key pillars. The first is the state duty to protect against human rights abuses by third parties, including corporations. Pillar 2 is a corporate responsibility to respect human rights, to avoid infringing human rights of others, and to address human rights impacts when they're involved. And the third pillar is the need for greater access by victims to effective remedy, both judicial and non-judicial, and the creation of operational and other grievance mechanisms to allow those issues to come to the attention of the company. We also have the framework principles on human rights that have developed key principles dealing with a number of procedural and substantive environmental rights. There are, of course, key ESG reporting and disclosure frameworks, and we might talk about those a little bit later. But these are things that are set up a lot in the EU that has led the charge for companies to identify and report on various ESG requirements. There are also national laws that have been imposed in France, Germany, and the Netherlands on responsible businesses and responsible investment. We also have modern slavery laws in the UK and Australia dealing with the issue of human slavery in corporate. And then we have also issues of climate taxonomy that also impact on a range of corporate decision-making. Within Southeast Asia, we also see in Hong Kong and Shanghai, China and elsewhere, a number of key reporting requirements. And in Australia and Singapore, these have also been adopted. And so finally, in terms of dealing with the risk, one of the things that we propose is the idea of due diligence. It's proposed in the OECD guidelines on multilateral investments. It's the idea of boards and managers and individuals approaching the idea of risk assessment in this idea of due diligence. It's the way they should carry out to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how to address actual and potential adverse impacts. It's an ongoing process that is related to the particular activity of the corporation, of the enterprise, and it can also be done by governments. The ESG due diligence usually has these four components: to identify and assess the actual and potential adverse risks and impacts, to integrate those findings within the processes, within the operations of the company, to track ESG performance, very important to measure, to quantify, and to identify, are those adverse impacts being effectively addressed? And finally, to communicate publicly, including formal reporting, but also to communities and other stakeholders who may be affected, the actual and potential ESG impacts. We also have a number of tools that these are the ones that I often use in my environmental impact assessment work and advice that I provide to governments on environmental management systems, environmental impact assessment itself, and things such as the life cycle assessment, which is done on particular products or particular services to ensure that we can look at a whole range of issues that might go beyond the operation of the company or the system, but also the products, the materials that are being used, and the products that are being produced. And the life cycle assessment does create a range of options for major products. Environmental management system is a way that a company or an enterprise can integrate a process once it's identified and adopted the due diligence approach to formalize that process so everyone knows what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to do it. This is a chart which is quite complex, but it talks about this circular approach to embedding responsible business conduct, and it's drawn from the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and the guidance document that they have on their website. It talks about the idea that this is a completely circular approach from the identification and the assessment, the mitigation and management, the tracking and the communication. And that means that once you communicate, once you identify some problems, if the system is not working, then it's always possible to rectify and respond to that. Again, this is another approach within this environmental due diligence, the idea of having a series of steps for corporations and enterprises to approach how they manage risk, how they identify those risks that have been identified, and then how to respond and deal with those. And tracking and implementation and communication are all key components of a due diligence and risk assessment process. And I just want to finish the way I often do, that to recognize that we are in a very significant, challenging environment. We'll hear today on some of the particular issues on climate change and natural disasters. And some of my concerns stem from a report that was done in 2021 by the UN Environment Programme, Making Peace with Nature, when the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, said, "Humanity is waging war on nature. This is senseless and suicidal. Making peace with nature, securing its health and building on the critical and underlying benefits that it provides are key to a prosperous and sustainable future for all." And finally, when we're talking about climate change and environmental risk now and beyond, the argument we have to look at, and using ESG as a tool, do we continue with business as usual? And we've seen the disasters that are currently occurring that will create negligence and liability for corporations and entities and professionals. Do we fight against nature, which is expensive and unprofessional? Or do we use ESG as a tool to become responsive and adaptive, to apply due diligence, look beyond compliance, and try and stop and cease our war with nature to achieve a much better, sustainable and prosperous future? Thank you very much for the opportunity of being here, and I will stop sharing the screen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for that comprehensive and very clear discussion and introduction on ESG overview on all the key environmental and social governance risks and how to actually assess them, identify, and report them. And also, Matthew, it's very interesting how you how you laid out all these global instruments and also up to the domestic and legal frameworks that we have for ESG, as well as in this context of environmental and climate crisis, which makes ESG a very important tool for our businesses. Now, we have an overview and we have 4 more speakers and panelists. In this session, the next panelist is also very knowledgeable on ESG. She is actually an ESG lawyer. She is none other than Bryony Eels. She's the team leader for the for the Asian Development Bank's Environmental and Climate Change Law Judicial Capacity Building Program. This program supports judiciaries in Asia and the Pacific to strengthen their knowledge and procedures for environmental and climate change law adjudication. Bryony has advised public and private sector clients for over 20 years, both in Australia and across Asia. Her work has included updates to national climate law, climate change strategy, and laws on environmental crime. She has also provided advice for entities on resettlement, engaging with indigenous communities, and risk. So everyone, let's all welcome Bryony. Bryony, you have the floor, please.
So I just click on that, right? Yes, that's right. Okay. All right, thanks so much. Hello, everyone, and hi, everyone online. It's a pleasure to be here. Like Matthew, I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and that they have a continuing connection with the land and waters. So we thank them for their protection of coastlines and ecosystems. And I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So I'm here to talk to you about climate risk, and hopefully I can do my glasses on long glasses. This is what I realized during the pandemic. Before I didn't need the glasses, and now I do. So that was my big lesson. So when we talk about climate change liability risks, there are often 3 broad categories that we're thinking about. We're thinking about the physical risk. So we all understand that physical risk of sudden and onset climate change and how that impacts your company or business physically. There's now this transition risk. So as the world transitions to net zero by 2050, that's going to change legal and regulatory frameworks. It's going to change consumer patterns. And you will need to start investing in just transition and adaptation costs. The last is this liability risk, and that's the risk that you would be embroiled in legal disputes in relation to climate change. And I should say that they can also arise in relation to this physical risk and the transition risk. When I talk about climate litigation, there are various definitions of what that is, and people can't agree. But I take the view that we are in the 21st century and we need 21st century solutions for our challenges. So when I talk about climate change, I'm talking about what are the things in litigation that will have an impact on climate change outcomes. So it's litigation that may include climate change as a central issue, a peripheral issue, or even cases that don't mention climate change but have impacts. So the preservation of mangroves, for example, will help with carbon sequestration, but they will also help with adaptation. Climate litigation trends, many people talk about first wave, second wave, third wave generation. I tend to keep it simple. It's really going to be looking at climate mitigation. So how do we prevent emissions or slow them down or draw them down? So carbon sequestration. How do we adapt to climate change? That's part of just transition. How do we build the future that we want to see, knowing that no matter what we do, climate change will impact us. And then this is a third wave, is really this corporate litigation where companies are now starting to be sued more directly. The earlier climate suits that we saw targeted governments, and they still do. So that still forms the bulk of cases that we see. And these big cases tend to be focused on a rights-based approach. They can be human rights, whether they're embedded in a local constitution, or sometimes rights are embedded within statutory frameworks. For example, EIA frameworks is a very significant area of climate litigation. We're also starting to see trends with international laws being relied upon. So people are starting to say, as a country has signed the Paris Agreement, that creates obligations. People use that as a hook for their litigation. So looking at some of the big cases against government, and I mention these even in the business context, because as people sue governments, policy and legal frameworks shift. So that creates a change. That's your transition risk. Many people have heard of this first case of the state of the Netherlands and Uganda versus Uganda. This is really the first time we saw a court ordering a government globally to reduce its emissions targets to achieve the outcomes of the Paris Agreement. And the basis of that litigation fell on the European Convention for Human Rights. And the court said, we have these obligations under this convention. They are brought into our legal system because of the Constitution and the operation of Dutch law, and we must therefore uphold those rights. I've given an Asian case as the second case, which is a case from Nepal, Advocate Padam Shrestha versus the Prime Minister. This is the first time we saw in Asia a court ordering its government to pass a climate change law. It did that because the Nepalese constitution has a right to life, an express right